Welcome to Crossing Faiths. I'm John Pinna, and today we have Shugen present and here to speak to us about his role in a local Buddhist community here as a Roshi or Abbot of the community. And so welcome. Well, thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you, John. Thanks for inviting me.
You know, I made the comment. It was funny. We're in such close proximity. We probably should be doing this in person, but it's in any event. I appreciate you taking the time and stepping out of your role as Abbot, which sounds like a big role. Everybody knows Abbot from these looking at the abbots of different monasteries and so forth. Maybe just talk a little bit about what it means to be an abbot in your community.
Yeah, well, I don't step out of it for one. It goes with me where I am. It's the sort of spiritual and to some degree administrative leader of our community. And so we were founded in 1980 by my teacher, John Daido Lori Roshi, and he taught for almost 30 years until he died in 2009. And at that point, or soon thereafter, I became the abbot here. So it's basically responsible for teaching on an ongoing basis to our students and residents, to guiding the community, sort of having a sense of the vision of where the community is going, how it's responding to things of our time, as well as, importantly, in balancing that with maintaining the sort of deeper aspects of our tradition that have come down over really thousands of years, beginning with the Buddha in India. So there's this ongoing dynamic between maintaining the essential aspects of that tradition and really understanding what those are, and at the same time being able to adapt and respond to things of this time. So that's kind of my job.
Well, I appreciate it. So it's the same. There's administrative elements. You guys have programming, and of course, then you have the spiritual sort of life on site that you're sort of managing. And so it's similar to the same terms and the same roles that we would know traditionally in the West.
Yeah, we have a residential community, so we have monastics who live here make lifetime commitments, and then we have people who come in for various amounts of time who train really within the monastic discipline while they're here. So, and that's usually about a core of about 35 people on an ongoing basis. And then we have people who come in for programs on an ongoing basis, all of which are basically within the sort of context and framework of Buddhist practice.
Well, let's take a little step into Buddhist practice. We get a lot of questions about Buddhism, and like I said, I've had some multi-faith experience, but I don't think I would be. I can maybe on broad strokes talk a little bit about Buddhism, but maybe you could walk us through a little bit about, what's like the core elements of Buddhism and how, it ties into sort of the larger spiritual community. Because I know that they're just different sects, obviously, but maybe just walk through the Four Noble Truths and some of the elements that are composed of the faith.
Okay, well, that's a lot, so I'll try and really focus here. So the Buddha, lived over 2,500 years ago in India. He was a person, a human being who left home and went seeking. His real concern was, why do human beings suffer? And he framed that within sort of the inevitable or inescapable truths of aging, sickness, and death, and which all creatures, living creatures, are subject to. So why do human beings with human consciousness struggle so much with those realities? And so in his enlightenment experience, he was liberated in his own teachings from the sense of a permanent sort of essential sense of self. And so what he realized was that, because we all have a sense of ourselves, we can I can talk to you and at the same time be aware that I am talking to you. And it's as though there is something in me, which is me, sort of the essence of me. I can think of myself when I was 5 years old. And although I was very, very different, I have the sense that it was me when I was 5 years old, right? There's not this sort of break of continuity. And Buddhism recognizes that our consciousness does that, but it says that we impute into that a sense of an eternal, sort of permanent sense of self. In a Western context, we might think of that as a soul. And what the Buddha in his meditative practice discovered was that he couldn't locate, not conceptually, but rather through direct experience, he couldn't locate anything that had those qualities, that was eternal, that was the essence of who we are, that was ongoing and continuous. And that liberation, or we speak of it as an emptiness of self, as being empty of anything permanent, liberated him from defending, building up, fear of losing with death, all of the things that we sort of inevitably act out of with a sense of self, because there's me, and then there seems to be a clear boundary between me and you.
Sure.
So if you are threatening or you say something critical, I have the sense that myself has been criticized, myself has been somehow threatened, and I react as though I've been threatened, even though they're just words that you spoke. And so it's that sense of self that's being threatened. And so the Buddha, in all of his teachings, talked about his teachings as a path. And this is sort of an important point. In the West, we have this very strong sense of a religion.
Right.
And in India, there was no sense of that. That wasn't a term that was used. So it really was a path, and which really does convey the sense of a path that you walk along, that you follow, and that you have to sort of move yourself. So there's a sense of action, that we need to be doing something. And that path is to see into the causes of our suffering as human beings, and how to liberate ourselves from that suffering. And by suffering, we don't really have time to get into the deeper meaning of that, but he included every experience that we might have, good or bad, when we cling to it.
Right.
So we don't like unpleasant things, right? So we want to avoid those things. When we have pleasant things, we want to preserve those, right? We want to get those to persist, but they don't, because they're all impermanent. And we suffer when we lose those good things that we want to cling to. And so he talked a lot about the tendencies to cling to the good and to reject the bad, and to try and free ourselves from those two impulses. And he called that alternative, you might say, a middle way, a middle path, which is not
so like
a sense of balance, but rather a kind of liberating from either of those two forms of grasping. And so all of his teachings and the practices, the things we do in Buddhism, are all sort of geared towards examining the nature of our suffering, which is not so much, an enlightened being. He got very sick at the end of his life and was in an enormous amount of pain. So enlightenment doesn't mean you don't have a human body and you don't have human, sensations. But he talked about that it's like you're being shot with a dart when you are in pain, but then you shoot a second dart, which is the mental anguish, the sort of wishing that this wasn't happening. Why is this happening to me? This shouldn't be happening. The anger that might arise, all of that mental anguish, that's really the suffering that we aim to free ourselves of. So that when we do experience the inevitable aspects of having a human body as we get older and get sick and die, we can experience those natural things without creating and adding a lot of unnecessary suffering.
And so a lot of it is the pursuit of to it too, right? It's the idea of chasing after, wealth, or chasing after food, or whatever it is, that there's a whole dynamic of that as well, right? The pursuit.
Right, exactly. So you and I were talking about your cafe and having donuts, right? And you said, well, maybe that'd be a problem because it raises desire. So desire in and of itself is not really an issue in Buddhism. It's the clinging to it, right? The desire to practice as a Buddhist is a desire, right?
Right.
So rather, that's a good desire. The desire to bring more justice into the world, the desire to love, to have compassion. Those are good desires. But when we cling to them, then they begin to become painful, and they cause suffering. There's a saying that says, even gold dust, when thrown into your eyes, will blind you. Even something that's positive, if we grasp at it, will become a kind of poison.
Yeah, I appreciate you, walking us through that a little bit. It's because a lot of times, everybody talks about Buddhism, and it's, something you kind of treat like a UFO sighting. Something's going on, you can't really explain it. But I think you really succinctly elaborated on, like, really the conceptual elements of it. I know that's a very rich and deep faith, and so the idea behind it of suffering is core, but how that is perceived and how that's looked at, I think it's very, our listenerships, we get a lot of questions about that. So I appreciate you kind of walking through that with us.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of common misperceptions, misunderstandings. For instance, of course, there's a heavy emphasis on non-attachment in Buddhism. And sometimes the word detachment shows up in the literature. And people sometimes misconstrue that to mean a kind of coldness or aloofness or distance. It's not. To love somebody is intimacy. But if I cling to my love for you, that's no longer really love, right? If I'm trying to control, if I want you to be a certain way and then I'm really going to love you, so it's like I'm trying to make you into something that you're not. So it's to really grasp at that love, then it really taints it, right? Turns it into something. It's not about being aloof at all. That's in a sense the illness that we're trying to heal ourselves from.
Right.
The grasping actually puts us at a distance from things. So in Buddhism, non-attachment is not to distance or to grow cold. That's considered another form of suffering, but rather to just be very present and very immediate and intimate with our lives, but just not clinging.
It's like I said, I've spent a lot of time with the Buddhist community, and that's probably one of the clear explanations that I've had, and so I appreciate that, and you taking the time. So maybe we take a step back and talk about how you came to Buddhism. Where were you born? Were you part of a faith prior to you becoming or coming to Buddhism?
Well, I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and was not born into a family that had faith. So religion to me was very much an outside thing. I was an outsider to religion. And when I was very young in my teenage years, I knew everything, and I thought religion was just a bunch of, stories to keep us sort of pacified from our fear. But then in high school, I thought, well, there are a whole lot of people who have a lot of faith in religion. So I started going to different churches on Sundays and just exploring. And in the South at that time, there wasn't a lot of diversity, but
Sure.
I, did what I could. But I just didn't feel, because I didn't grow up in a family of faith, some of the concepts of Western religion were foreign to me. So I just didn't really connect. And it wasn't until but I did have some experiences, because part of what I was looking for was a community where religion seemed to really matter to the people.
Hmm.
Like it made a difference in how they actually lived. It wasn't something they were just doing on Sundays or Saturdays or whatever, but rather it was transformative.
Hmm.
And I just didn't find a lot that I was inspired by, but then I did. And within faiths that I thought were not really going to be my path, but at least I thought, well, it does exist.
Sure.
And when I encountered Buddhism, there just was no part of it that I felt like I couldn't connect with, because it was really based in human experience, human suffering, which I felt like even as a teenager, I had some experience of. I looked around at the people around me, particularly the adults, and I thought, I didn't see a lot of happiness, a lot of peace of mind, a lot of equanimity. I saw, I had friends who were very poor. I had some friends whose parents had money, and it didn't seem to matter a lot, And so I just was looking for a way I wanted my life to matter. I wanted to, not that I needed to be important, but I wanted to feel like my life was worthy and of the time that I had been given. And the fact that when I encountered Buddhism, there was a meditation practice that really connected with me, because I thought I knew that I needed to do something, that just encountering a teaching or body of, guidance was not, that it couldn't just be intellectual. I had to do something. And I was a musician, and so I was accustomed to going into my room and closing the door and practicing my instrument. So
Sure.
the idea of doing the same thing but practicing meditation kind of made sense. So I just started doing that. I was about 17, and I just started meditating. And that was basically my whole experience of Buddhism. Because in the South back then, I mean, I would probably have been arrested if I was a Buddhist, So,
Yeah, I can't imagine. I was say, I can't imagine. I'm not, indicting the South, but how did you? encounter, like in Atlanta? I'd just say, what was the point of critical mass? Where did you like you there was a Buddhist community there, or did you
No,
start reading about it? You started.
yeah. It was very hard to find information on it. You go to the encyclopedia and, it's not inspiring at all.
Sure.
I'll tell you one of the things that was formative, John, was during my high school years, they started to implement desegregation of the schools in the public school system, which was where I was going to school. And so over 3 years, they implemented that in steps. And so students and teachers were all zoned to different schools. Sure. And that, of course, shook a lot of things up. And of course, Atlanta was also a very sort of a nexus for the civil rights movement. And so, in fact, I went to school with some of the kids who were in Dr. Martin Luther King's sort of circle, Ralph Abernathy's kids. And so it was, even though I was too young to fully appreciate what was going on, it was sort of in the air. And yet, because it was very segregated, outside of school, in my world, nobody was talking about what was going on. My parents were, but I didn't have a single classroom or teacher or class in which they actually talked about what was happening, that we were in the middle of history and nobody was talking. And that's kind of classic Southern.
Sure.
You don't talk about what's difficult to talk about. And it was kind of crazy making, because something was going on that I felt like was very significant, and nobody was discussing it. And then after the civil rights, after I left high school and I stayed in the South, I felt like there was a kind of pushback that I started to experience where racism, I felt like sort of was coming out again in language, even amongst my peers. And I just thought, I'm done. And so I left and I moved up north where I thought everything was going to be different. And it wasn't exactly.
Yeah.
But so that's that was kind of important because it really started me thinking about people and culture and society and like, who are we and what are we doing and why do we how did this happen?
Right.
So I actually started studying a lot of history, which then as a Buddhist, I started to look at in terms of karma, how we create actions based on our desires, and those actions can go in very different directions. I was trying to understand, my country and the part of the country I grew up in and experiences I had and what was in me, and when I started to practice Buddhism, I felt like, because Buddhism has really just studied the nature of mind and consciousness for 2,500 years, and how we come to have the beliefs and the impulses and the attachments and how we get caught in these cycles of thinking and speaking and behavior, which are very hard just to will ourselves out of.
Sure. And you talk about suffering, the idea of having the backdrop of the civil rights movement, but then you have this thing that I always hear, and I've with my Buddhist friends, they talk about mindfulness and compassion. Right, these are the two biggies, right, that are kind of like core elements of the faith projecting outward. Right, is mindfulness and compassion, and so I can imagine those two mechanisms really being distilled in that moment where you're becoming, or you're investigating this faith, and you're having a case of the feels, trying to figure out, okay, this is where I grew up, this is this new faith, but mindfulness, compassion are the two biggest things. And if you're seeing a lot of stuff happen around you, I would imagine it ossifying, kind of really solidifying the idea that this is probably the right path for me. Is that, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but is that it's because what an amazing sort of element where you're the backdrop of the civil rights movement, integration, and this was going on. Then what's the sort of natural thing is, I'm going to leave here and I'm going to go someplace better. And then you get there and you're like, this is it. It's different. It's just a different type of integration that's going on here. And so it must have been a really crazy moment in time, where your faith became elevated to the point where did it accelerate you towards the core of Buddhism, or what happened once you came to the north?
Well, I was so much on my own with this in the beginning. There were, this is going back into the late 70s. So there's Buddhism, was in a very different place. It was very much an outlier thing. There were very few books. There were like 2 books on Zen Buddhism that were in print at that time. Of course, there was no internet. It was very hard to get information. So it's very paucity of material on that. So And like I said, I was the only person I knew who was doing this. So I was very isolated in that. So I just kept meditating. And Buddhism, I knew it existed as a, one of the major world religions, but I didn't know anything about it. And it wasn't until, and I just kept doing that and meditating on my own without any real sense of, I mean, I had plans. I was going to school. I was finishing. Had plans for my career.
Sure.
And I was living in the Hudson Valley, and I was dating somebody who was also a meditator. And at one point she said, there's a monastery up the road. And so I said, well, let's go. So we went. And the first time I went, and I was at that time kind of more hermetic. The things I loved to do were tended to be more solitary. I did a lot of camping and cross-country biking, and I spent a lot of time
Sure.
in the woods. I wasn't a big join a community person. And yet when I came here the first time, I felt like I was home, which was also, I couldn't explain that. That seemed very weird.
Hmm.
And there was this community, and I didn't want to leave, which was also very weird because it was kind of not like me,
Right.
There was something that I felt that I just was very compelling. My teacher used to talk about a spiritual imperative, and I wouldn't have been able to say those words at that time. I couldn't have even explained what was happening to me. I
Hmm.
really didn't have that kind of understanding. It was very internal. And I was just really responding to what I was experiencing. But once I came here and started studying Buddhism more formally, then it was like I started to encounter language. It was like one of the first times I encountered a book on Buddhism, I thought, you people know more about me than I do.
Huh.
And that was
Interesting.
very compelling.
Hmm.
And the more I studied, the more I just felt like that was being affirmed. And it just started to both help me understand things, but also give me a way in to
Yeah.
start to deal with a lot of the turmoil and inner, doubt and just the, dis-ease that I felt. And
Interesting.
and so the faith, I wouldn't have even used that word. In fact, I would have avoided using that word because I so associated it with, you know, traditional religions that I just didn't understand,
Right.
Knew that Buddhism wasn't centered around God, and I thought faith is centered around God. So thought, I don't know what that would even mean in Buddhism, but Buddhism is profoundly dependent upon faith. I mean,
Sure.
a person has to have faith in the teachings, in the
Yeah.
practice.
Without a doubt. Yeah. And here's a question for you. So what's the next is the moment where, all right, you're going out with a girl, you're going out with somebody, and then you're going to school, you have your career. How does that tip into going into the order, and becoming a monk, right? A Buddhist monk, right? Like, what was the point of critical mass where that happened? Because I understand now kind of how you were on a search. You kind of got on the path yourself. You're enlightening yourself. But you're still living a traditional sort of American life, and
Right.
this is kind of your part of your identity. But then you get to the monastery, you're saying, I don't want to leave. But you've outlined your life in a very American fashion.
Yeah, I had a plan, and it wasn't
Yeah.
this. Um, so I originally went to school to study mathematics. I wanted to teach high school mathematics. And then at the end of my third year, I shifted and I decided I wanted to go full time into music, which is something that had been very important to me since I was very young. And I had kept up in a pretty serious way. So I switched and started and shifted my major to music and got my degree in music. I spent about a year or two trying to be a working musician. I was also waiting tables and, paying my bills, but I was trying to, develop a career as a musician. And
Sure.
there was a point at which I just decided that I didn't want to continue doing that. And so I went back to school to finish my undergraduate degree and begin a master's in mathematics so that I could teach. And very quickly, and at this point, I had already begun coming to the monastery. I would come up almost every week because I was living in the Hudson Valley. I was about an hour away. It was very significant for me. And I remember I was coming home from classes, I was walking to my apartment, and there was a moment in which I just knew that what I wanted to do was devote my life to this as a monastic. And
Hmm.
I remember talking the next Sunday to my teacher, and this was, the place had only been here for 5 years. It was a very small community, struggling financially. It wasn't clear that it was going to make it. It wasn't clear to me it was going to make it.
Right.
Sat down with my teacher and the head monk, and I said, I really want to be a monk. I hadn't even moved in yet, and he
Huh.
was very encouraging. And the
Yeah.
head monk looked at me and she said, we'll see,
Okay.
because it's easy to have a dream.
Right. And to fall in love with a place. And,
Exactly.
once, it's difficult once you have to figure out how the sausage is made, so to speak.
So I moved in the spring of 1986. I'd already been coming here for about a year and a half. And I moved in, and at that point, my intention was to not leave. But we have a process of discernment
Mm.
for monastics where you sort of live the life before you make final vows. And so I did that for a period of years and was ordained in 1988, and here I am now. So that was sort of the precipitous moment when I
Mm.
knew that that was what I wanted to do. But I think, obviously there was a whole internal thing happening, that I was aware of, but only to the degree that I was aware of it.
Right. I mean, well, what an amazing, it's an amazing story, coming from the Southern boy, coming, from the Baptist. I don't know if that's the Bible Belt, but from the, Southern Baptist, that whole thing, that business. And on the backdrop of the civil rights movement, you come up here, you're trying to live your life, you find a, and then you're kind of, it's a very Buddhist sort of way of thing. Everything kind of falls into place, right? You kind of have found a place to go. You interact with that place. You become, it becomes a sanctuary for you, and then you kind of spend your time and then become a monk. What's the path once you become a monk? I mean, because you can sit there and just be kind of cloistered, right? And pray and it's a self-improvement, learn and so forth. But there's a whole nother component of this. You're the abbot, so now you're responsible for the community.
Yeah.
There's a track, associated with that, and then on top of that, it's, you're talking with me on the podcast. We're chatting a little bit about this because you could be looking more inward, focusing on your community and the retreats and so forth. So how do you go from wanting to be a monk to leading the community?
Well, day by day, obviously. And at the point when I entered, all I wanted to do was live this life, live a monastic life, live within the Dharma, the Buddhist Dharma, and serve,
Mm.
And that even in the beginning wasn't very strong. It was actually pretty self-centered in the beginning. It was really, I need to do this for me. I have all these questions. I need to find peace within my own life. But in our tradition of Buddhism, that is held up in the same way as being of service to others. They're mutually dependent upon each other. And so, even though that wasn't where I was at in the beginning, I had entered a tradition which is all about that. And so, over time, that sort of blossomed in me more and more as a naturally arising longing and desire and need was to make my life of purpose for others. But the day to day, it's like it's a very disciplined life. So I'm up every morning, usually by 3 a.m. We have morning meditation. I like to get up early. I love the morning and to do some additional sitting. Sitting in our tradition means meditation. And so we're always up all together either by 4:30, or 5 at the latest. We do meditation every morning. We also do walking meditation. We do services where we chant Buddhist sutras, teachings, and different teaching texts. When we chant something, it enters your mind in a different way. So that's part of our practice. We have a lot of time in silence. We also work. And in Buddhism, in our tradition, work is really seen as an integral part of a religious life. So we work as a meditation. So sometimes we work in silence, sometimes we lift the silence so that in a sense, you're moving more and more into an ordinary kind of circumstance that most people would experience, but you're learning how to do that in a very mindful and wakeful way. And so all the residents have different responsibilities. So I was the cook. I did advertising. I ran the store. I was the registrar. We have a very active Buddhist prison sangha that we've had for 40 years. I was very, very involved with that for a long time. And I was a bookkeeper forever. I was operations, and part of the monastic training, ideally, is through the course of your career, you do everything.
Sure.
Have every position so that by the end, you know how to run a monastery. Not everybody, it's really dependent upon the person, their inclination, how they develop. So I didn't come here to be a teacher. I didn't come here to be the abbot. I came here to be a monk. That was what I wanted.
Sure.
But over time, I took on more and more responsibility. And at a certain point, in our tradition, we talk about empowerment, where the teacher basically authorizes, gives authority to the student to be a teacher in their own right. And then when before he died, we have a center in Brooklyn in the city. And so I went down there to be the abbot for 10 years. And then I needed to come back up here in 2015 and step into the role of the abbot here. And I also, part of my role is to be the head of our order,
Sure.
sort of the umbrella for everything that we do. So it was very, very step by step, very incremental. I mean, this is my 40th year. So it takes a long time. And, we have some monastics who are monks. That's what their life is. They won't necessarily go on to be teachers.
Sure.
And so, it really has to do a lot with the person and how they develop and so on. But it's a very, disciplined day by day life. We do have people coming in, so sort of the world flows in through the people that come here. And because of that vow to serve, we work in the prisons. We have what we call an Earth Initiative, which is trying to work with how to be in the world and in relationship to the earth in a way that is harmonious. And we work with, we have a program called Beyond Fear of Differences, which is really about examining and trying to uproot and undo the bases of our biases. In a sense, in Buddhism, the attachment to a sense of self is the fundamental bias, right? To see the world in terms of me. But then societally, biases are created, right, to elevate and denigrate different groups of people. And largely because of my upbringing in the South, that was something that I really needed to work out. And I felt like Buddhism was really beautifully poised to do that because its teachings really understand how we attach to our false views of things, including people.
Sure.
And we can attribute a characteristic as an absolute quality, which is the form of a basis of any bias,
Right.
And so we developed this program called Beyond Fear of Differences, which basically deals with all forms of bias. We originally focused on race and gender, but basically because they're all sort of similar and different.
Yeah.
And so that way, we're engaging with aspects of our culture, and all of these are, in a sense, you could look at them as forms of suffering.
Right. And want, suffering, and mindfulness, all these elements sort of come to bear. So you have programs there, right? We just talked a little bit, but before we started, about you coming off a retreat. And so you facilitate a lot of programming. So you're just mentioning one of them is the programming focuses on just sort of short term. People can come in residence and spend some time and go. And what's the sort of just brief pantheon of programming that you have there that you serve when it comes to serving the community and having them come in?
Well, it's changed a bit over the years. We have a way of training that includes what we call body practice and creativity in terms of really using it as a meditation, moral teachings, Buddhist study, really understanding core teachings. And so we bring in instructors to lead retreats. All the retreats that we do are done within the context of Buddhist practice. So when people are here for a retreat, they all will get up before dawn. They'll all do meditation. They'll do services. And they're not being asked to take on, Buddhism as a tradition, but just to engage in the different practices so they can be active participants. So we have an introductory retreat once a month. We do these intensive meditation retreats once a month that are week long. And then we do various retreats on Buddhist study and so on. And then we have a program where people almost every month will come in for a month and really train alongside the monastics in the life of a monastery and really be immersed. And some of those people will elect to stay on for a year. and they
Wow.
then become part of our sort of working staff because they are here long enough we can train them to take on some responsibilities.
Sure.
Some of those people elect to stay for a second year. At
Hmm.
the end of the second year, if they don't want to enter the monastic path, then they need to leave because they're a lay person. We don't want them to stay here too long and kind of
Sure.
lose touch with their lay life.
Interesting. Wow. I mean, it's an amazing moment because, or sort of amazing kind of community, because a lot of the sort of faith communities, monasteries and stuff out there, you might be able to go on a retreat or you might be able to spend some time, but to actually immerse yourself and spend time with the order is unique. And is that a common element within the Buddhist community, or is that something that sets your order apart?
Well, I mean, there are lots and lots of Buddhist communities around the country. Most of them are quite small and less formal, from living rooms to, a house but mostly run by lay people.
Sure.
There are only a couple of actually training monasteries where people are ordained and are sort of live the life of a monastic. And so there aren't many communities that do what we do. It's hard. It's hard to
It
do.
sounds unique, yeah, and it's difficult because you also want to you want to maintain your identity within the order, but then when you let outsiders in, there's also sort of mission creep and all kinds of other things that could happen. Plus, there's a responsibility of maintaining the mission, the vision, and the identity of the entity of the monastery. It sounds quite unique, which is why I was kind of engaging that. And then the other side of it is they're in the Hudson Valley. There's a lot of different Buddhist communities here. When I grew up, like I said, there's the largest Buddha in Western Hemisphere is in Fawnstock. There was over by in Poughkeepsie by Bowden Park. I know there's a stupa there, and then just Shambhala is like right down the road here in Kingston. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of communities here, and so and a lot of them are sort of not, I don't want from an outsider, it's like, well, let's go and we'll go talk to we'll go to the Buddha, we'll go hang out for a little bit, we'll spend some time. I know a great place to get lunch right around the corner, it's that type of thing. But there seems to be a lot more of a formal programming, a monastic life that you're willing to share with people, which is quite unique.
Yeah, we have on every Sunday, we have an open morning program where people can come in and receive instruction meditation. But they jump in. So they'll do service with chanting and prostrations. There's meditation. There's a formal talk that's given. Usually I offer a formal teaching on every Sunday, and then we have lunch. So it is open to the community. John, there's an ongoing dynamic. I speak of it as healthy tension between the cloister, which is more, sort of holding,
Right.
because that's part of what we provide. When people come, they're coming from all of the activity in the news and, all of the stress and, um, activity of the world, and they're coming to sort of temporarily step into a place of quiet
Sure.
so they can find that within themselves so that
Yeah.
they can go back out. So, but at the same time, we do we feel we have a responsibility to the world and to the larger community. And so we have to hold this sort of tension between how much to sort of preserve that cloister and how much to reach out. And
Right.
so we're constantly sort of discussing that and in balance. There are projects that we have started over the years that we then sort of stopped, even though they were really good projects, because they thought they had the potential to sort of undermine and diminish that sort of
Mm.
basic core purpose. The almost every religion, it's hard to keep something alive when you do something over and over and over. If you're a
Right.
meditator, if you pray, whatever a practice is, once we start to do it over and over, it begins to become repetitive and we stop paying attention. And
Sure.
within religious practice, that's kind of like the kiss of death. It's sort of the form takes over and we're just kind of walking through the motion. So, so in every country where Buddhism has existed, it's become institutionalized over time. it's sort of been brought out into the larger community, which means it has to be made a little easier, a little bit more accessible. Monasteries usually are places that protect, sort of the core principles, the core teachings and practices, if the tradition has monasteries. And so that's an ongoing dynamic to try and preserve that vitality and that sort of essential heart of what the tradition is, that is the heart of what is transformative about it, so that it doesn't become rote or mechanical.
Right. And it's that welcoming is still there, and it keeps it dynamic. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people that come in who are, like me, kind of, I was just chatting with a buddy of mine, and he did a survey. He's an ex staff member of mine who does surveys now, and he's doing stuff about work life, and so he said, can I survey you? And I go, yeah, sure. And he goes, well, how many hours a week do you work? And I go, well, I don't know, 80 to 100. And he goes, that's not possible. That's certainly not possible, and it's not sustainable. I go, oh, it is. And he goes, well, how can you do that? And I go, well, this is the life that I live. I'm similar to you in the sense that I wake up at 2:30, 3 o'clock every morning, and old habits die hard. So I get up, I make my international calls, I go to the bakery, I do the bakery now, then I get back into my international work. I will ping back to the bakery. I'm, maintaining a house and doing all kinds of other things. And so I've kind of created this sort of, I don't know where that fits in sort of the mindfulness or the suffering situation, but I'm defined by my work, and my work is, service and human rights and all kinds of other good stuff. And so the challenge is that I have that sort of lifestyle, right? But to break out of that, if I was going to come to you for a month or even for a Sunday, I thought about it when you said Sunday. I go, I don't think there's any way I could get there. And Sunday, that was the thing that was going on in my mind. And so I know that I would have to really step out just to be in your world, which I will do. I'll make the commitment here on air that certainly come and spend some time with you. It'd be great to step out, put the phone down. And although I balance that myself, it's difficult when you, even because you have your own routine that still you're imposing upon yourself and has that sort of leeway, right? It's different when you're stepping into someone else's order. And I don't mean monastic order, but someone else's order of the world, and trying to put all that stuff aside. So it must be very challenging with all the different personalities that come in, and lifestyles to balance that, and still maintain outcomes for the individual and the order. Because I'm sure you're growing every day, every retreat upon retreat, you expand not only your programming but your knowledge of what's happening in the world, because you're actually socializing the world with with the order, with the monastery.
Well, it's self-selecting, obviously. So for some people, I mean, we have students who are in all kinds of positions in life and lifestyles and so on. So some people have time where they can do a lot of meditation practice. Some people, it's one of many things that they do during the course of the day. They have very full lives. So people make choices. And Buddhism in general is not really prescriptive. It really leaves it up to the individual, because, you can't make somebody meditate. You can't make them want to let go. It has to come from within. And so in that way, it is self-selecting. And people usually come in, and just like stick their toe in the water. And if they're interested, then they might come and do it again. And usually it's very step by step, and they don't have a sense of where they're going. And I try and encourage them not to, because they don't know, and I don't know either. And it's, you just sort of follow your heart and whatever you feel like you're being drawn to. So, and so we do, part of that balance is, I'm sure people come here. I could probably poll the residents and ask them, would you rather get up at 6 or 7? And, there'd probably be a consensus. So people are asking, they're really being asked to let go of their own preferences. And that's a basic Buddhist practice.
Right.
To our attachment. I want things this way. I like this. I don't like this. I'd like to be with this person, not with that person. I mean, the Buddha said that sort of simple, essential way of talking about our suffering is, you get what you don't want, you don't get what you want, you're with who you don't want to be with, you're not with who you want to be with. And then he talked about it in some much more complex ways, but very ordinary, everyday experience, right? In which we can spend a lot of mental and emotional energy,
Sure.
sort of brewing over all of that. And so part of the meditation practice is when you sit on the cushion and turn your attention to the breath, your mind will bring forth thoughts and memories and emotions and sensations. Some of them you'll like and you'll want to hold on to. Some of them you won't like and the person will want to reject or
Right.
suppress. And the practice is a middle way to neither grasp nor reject. And in that way, we develop the capacity to tolerate a certain amount of discomfort. Because like if you're experiencing a difficult emotion, it's like you're angry and you think, no, I'm not an angry person. I don't want to be angry. That's not me. But there is actual anger. And so it's very uncomfortable to experience that. I'd much rather divert my attention and blame it on somebody else, right?
Right.
And so the meditation is just sit in front of that, within the presence of that anger, like it's a fire, and just feel the heat. Don't fix it. You don't even have to understand it, but just tolerate, but in an open mind, not like
Sure.
gritting your teeth, but actually with a much more expansive, peaceful mind.
Yeah.
And in that way, we're learning how to not react so much to our likes and dislikes, which is so much of how we get into trouble.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting. I people come into the bakery like all the time, and the first thing they start to do is start to weigh everything, and it's funny because they're not enjoying the smell, they're not enjoying the decorum, they're not just taking a moment. And so I a common a common way for me to engage sort of customers and when I'm there is I'll say is how are you doing? Is everything okay? And they'll look and I go, you got very serious faces for being in a donut shop. And right away they kind of smile and everything else. I was like, don't worry. I was like, I'll say something like that hostile thing take over. We'll go through or I'll look out the window like past them and I'll say, you lost them. They're not after you anymore. So I'll say something like that and use that as sort of a tactic to get everybody to kind of relax a little bit. But they're right away they're like looking at the menu or they're trying to figure out what's going on, and so I'm certainly not poking fun or it's a mechanism that you use to kind of get everybody to kind of be in the moment and stop saying I have to order now or try to figure something out or try to you just walked into a donut shop. They take a moment.
In Buddhism, there's a very important principle we speak of: skillful means.
Okay.
So if I'm a doctor and if you have a deadly illness and I have the medicine that will save you, but you won't take it, then for you, it's not medicine, right?
Right.
You have to be willing. So there's a sense of even compassion, which in Buddhism is not just a feeling of compassion, but it's actively wanting to alleviate suffering.
Right.
And so to be skillful. So when you said that, told that little story, I hear that as skillfulness. So you're sort of getting people to stop for a moment,
Right.
sort of break the cycle of, this task, get something done. And you're making human contact with them, right? It's not just a transaction. You're making human contact and you're asking them how they are, which means they have to like turn inward for a moment, right?
Sure.
Or a joke, which is sort of, brings forth humor. So from a Buddhist practice perspective, those are very simple things, but they're actually effective at making contact.
Yeah, and that's the key. It's like, you're not just a customer, I'm a local boy. So it's one of those things to try to, kind of create an atmosphere where it's not just, you're not just customer X. Although I do have another tactic, and that's for the serious ones. Is you can always tell what's going on. Or someone asks if they have a special, and I always tell them with every purchase over $1,500, you get a free donut. And you can always tell the serious person because there's one person that kind of starts thinking, and the other one is if you buy half a donut, you get the second half free. You can buy as many halves as you want. And there's always a few that are brain biscuits are turning, and you're going, and I was like, are you there yet? Because it's just buying a donut. That's all it is. So and then of course during the course of things I'll say, how many halves do you want or something. But the and humor is, you could tell, is my go-to place. But the thing is it's funny, the sort of Buddhist concepts and they're I don't want to devalue, but they're global concepts of a lot of people are unable or unwilling to step out of the whatever it is that
Yeah.
binds them to
Yeah.
and tethers them to society, right? So you go into a donut shop and right away they feel overburdened with the task of ordering, or overburdened with trying to understand what's around them.
Yeah.
And it happens that, I've had an international career. I traveled 40 weeks a year for 25 years all over the world, and I would have to, usually when people were running out of country for something, a conflict, I was like one of the few people kind of walking in and heading in. And I was that way. I'd have to kind of be like, okay, what am I going to do here, and what's going on? And the first casualty of stepping into such a zone is the plan, but you need to have something in your head, right? So you're trying to minimize X factors, but it translates into the simplest things of just ordering a donut, right?
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I think is important, it was important to me about Buddhism, is that it really is a path, and that Buddhism is seen as a vehicle, it's even spoken that way, to practice liberation. And it recognizes there can be lots of different vehicles. That's why within Buddhism, the idea of conflict
Sure.
at all, but particularly conflict between religious traditions, has to be and can only be a mental construction.
Right.
That intrinsically there can be no, in fact, there is no conflict in the world other than conflicts we create in our mind.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, Buddhism is just a path with a sort of path of practices and teachings that can help a person understand who they are and what it is to be in a world in a way that is not, that is joyful and has equanimity and is compassionate and so on. And so, but it's really a vehicle. The Buddha said, when you want to cross a wide river, you build a raft.
Right.
And then you paddle the raft across. When you get across the other side, you don't need to carry the raft on your back.
Right.
And it's a metaphor for Buddhism as a vehicle. Don't turn it into something that seems to exist in and of itself. Right. So in a way, Buddhism is just talking about basic human, universal experiences and principles. Anybody who meditates within any tradition that has a sort of meditative, or you might say a kind of a mystical component,
Right.
will encounter some of the same things that Buddhism teaches and encounters, right? Because it's human, it's universal.
Sure. Well, and sitting by yourself, there's at 3 a.m. when you wake up and no one's around, you're confronting a lot of who you are, right, at that moment. And when you're meditating, or you're praying, or what, it's just you. So you can kind of go through the motions, but there's a point where the motions aren't enough, because you are going to be confronting some of the elements that are you, or the things that are coming into your world. Was that a fair assessment?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I know that you're heading to an appointment at 4ish, and so but I wanted to make sure that we took this time, and thank you for sharing who you are, what you're about, the community, and also some of the mindfulness and elements that are characteristics of your community, but certainly unique to your faith.
Well, thank you, John. And I really appreciate. I was remarking before we came on live about your career and all the work that you've done. In Buddhism, we speak of a bodhisattva, which is an enlightening being. Bodhi means enlightenment, sattva is being.
Sure.
And in Buddhism, there are bodhisattvas all over the place. And a bodhisattva is anybody who is acting in a selfless way to try and alleviate suffering, to bring people together, to sort of heal divisiveness and hatred and anger, is trying to bring peace when there's conflict. And it seems like you spent a lot of your life doing those things. And so I appreciate that, right? That we people in our world who are devoting themselves, right, to actually affirming life rather than being destructive.
Well, thank you so much for making that. That's very, very thoughtful of you. I appreciate it. I'm retired from my national security career, and I'm still working like crazy to try to do something. My mother says, you need to relax. My mother's 86, and she goes, can't you just relax and just make some money? That's
it's interesting, because in a way, I never do enough.
Yeah,
Right?
I feel the same way.
Never feel like I'm doing enough. And I have to find a way to be satisfied with what I am doing, because otherwise I'm in conflict, right? And that becomes corrosive.
Sure.
So I would just say we have to hold that balance, because you're not always going to be here. I'm not always going to be here. There's always more to do than there is time and capacity. And so we have to find that balance, right? That
Sure.
sweet tension between recognizing I can't put out all the fires, but what I can do something, and can I make my peace with what I can do?
Yeah, no, it's a struggle, the idea of leaving the world a better place than you found it. But in the same respect, knowing that you're trying to combat injustice, and work with all these parties that may or may not be willing to try to make something happen. But I appreciate you taking the time, and it's extremely thoughtful to thoughtful note about my career, and the efforts that we've tried to continue to do. But so thank you so much, and
Thank you, John. I
and it means
appreciate
a
it.
lot.
Good luck to you.